Welcome to the Unhinged Podcast. We are your hosts, Darius, and right to my left, I have Emma.
And today, Darius will be talking to you about the case of Jack the Ripper. So, before he begins, we just want to set a little disclaimer that the following content explores mature themes of homicide, violence, and sexual assault. Viewers' discretion is advised.
Is advised.
So now I will be talking to you about Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, also known as the Whitechapel Murderer or Leather Apron, was an unidentified serial killer. He terrorized the London area of Whitechapel in 1888, killing at least 5 women and mutilating their bodies in an unusual manner, indicating that he had substantial knowledge of the human anatomy. The culprit was never captured or even identified, and Jack the Ripper remains to this day one of England's and the world's most infamous criminal. There were 11 separate murders stretching from April 3rd, 1888 to February 13th, 1891. Were included in London Metropolitan Police Service investigation and known collectively as the Whitechapel murders. Opinions vary as to whether these murders should all be linked to the same culprit, but the 5 of the confirmed victims were known as the Canonical Five, and are widely believed to be work of Jack the Ripper. The Canonical Five Ripper victims are Mary Ann Nicole, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Streit, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These victims were the only proven victims of Jack the Ripper. So we will begin with Mary Ann Nicole, eventually understood to be the first of Jack the Ripper's victims. Mary Ann Nichols was a native of London who had spent a good deal of the 1880s on the drift. Her marriage to a man named William Nichols had apparently foundered after the birth of their sixth child, William's head had been irreversibly turned by a neighbor called Rosetta. Mary Ann was laying the roots of an incapable addiction to alcohol. She remarked on a dismal tour of the capital's workhouse and infirmary. She surrendered herself to the elements, sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, and finally, when she had squandered her last shot at rehabilitation, she gravitated so many unanchored people would to the East End. Prostitution was her last resource. By August 31st, 1888, she was homeless, without the money to pay for a bed in a lodging house. Indeed, she claimed to have earned and then drunk away to fourth pace fee several times over the day. At 2:30 a.m., an unacquaintance encountered her, drunk and staggering in the darkness, at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. This would be the last time Marian would knowingly been seen alive by anyone other than her killer. At 3:45 a.m., 2 men walking west along Bucks Row saw what they thought might have been an abandoned tarpaulin laying on the footpath. Closer inspection showed that it was the body of a woman, her throat cut, pulled in blood. Only when her body was stripped in a primitive local mortuary were the horrible incisions of Mary Ann's abdomen discovered, her intestines uncontained by the abdominal wall, threatened to push through the gaps. This unusual degree of brutality rendered her murder notable and abstract, alternative to the city's run-of-the-mill domestic homicides, but in a pattern which would be repeated with unhappy frequency over the following 2.5 months. No signs of her killer was found. The next victim was Annie Chapman. It was true to say that things had been better for Annie Chapman. Far from the rookery of Whitechapel, Spitalfield. She had spent part of her adolescence and later of her life of a married life in Windsor, in the shadow of Royal Castle. It may not have been the bit-coned real wealth, but it probably did go hand in hand with certain level of economic comfort. Annie and her husband John had even had their photograph taken in about 1969. The image, originally identified by the researcher Neil Stubbing Sheldon in 2001, is the only one to have of Jack the Ripper's canonical victims in life. A photograph that was not typically working class encounterment. Clearly the Chapmans were designated for better things, or at least little luxuries along the way. Annie, however, soon embarked on a familiar path, coming estranged from her family and increasingly intimate with a drink as the 1880s wore on. By 1888, she was isolated, malnourished, and suffering from chronic illness. She was also to be found on September 5th, 1888, brawling with another woman, Eliza Cooper, over a distributed piece of soap. Annie's face was marked in the fight. Perhaps this was a sight that her ability to defend herself was diminishing. And then, on 8th of September in early dawn, Annie's body was discovered in an unsecured yard behind 29 Hambury Street, and, as before, no sign of the predator. The next victim was Elizabeth Streit. The boat sank rapidly, gurgling into the filthy Thames, and Elizabeth struggled madly for safety, and in the crush she stumbled and fell, and the heel of a person in front of her brought the taste of iron to her mouth. Or so she said. The Princess Alice disaster in 1878 was genuine enough, but Elizabeth Streit's presence on board was a figment of her imaginations. Sympathy, perhaps. She claimed to have lost a husband and indeterminate number of children to the Dark River. The truth was less dramatic, but no more happy. Elizabeth Streit had graduated from Gothenburg Street to the less regulated equivalent in London, leaving behind a rather unfortunate early background and exchanging it for uncertain future. After marriage in the West End, she arrived inevitably in the less salubrious East. Early attempts to propose in a hostile commercial environment as the perpetrator of a coffee shop gradually lapsed, and following her husband's death, Elizabeth was thrown back on her resourcefulness and her untrustworthy recall. So it was that she found herself in Berners Street in the first minutes of 30 September 1888, spotted here and there by a clutch of generally well-meaning witnesses, dodging the autumn showers. But when she vanished into the shadow of the Dutchfield's yard, later to be detected by a hawker whose horse had shied away from something lying peacefully still before it. And to the right, he descended from his cart to investigate. By matchlight, the face appeared. By lantern light, the wound to her throat and the familiar hue and cry. The police, the doctor, the matter remained invisible, nowhere to be found. Elizabeth's abdomen had been defiled. In the matter of her predecessors, and immediately minds began to turn on the significance of this rapid de-escalation. They turned to this day, and Elizabeth's position within the canon of Ripper victims is, some feel, an insecure one. But there is one version of the story which says that the implications of the Ripper's failure to mutilate Elizabeth had very particular consequences. And in this version, those consequences would become known an hour later, less than a mile away. Catherine Eddowes, which is the next victim. If you had been in Aldgate High Street 8:30 on an evening of 29th of September 1880, you would have seen P.C. Lewis Robinson peering down at the figure in the shadows, laying at his feet. A crowd gathered, but nobody knew her. He took her up and propped her against the shutters of a shop. She slipped drunkenly sideways. After a few hours in the cells at Bishopgate Police Station, Catherine Eddowes was slightly recovered from her binge and ready to be released. She had studiously avoided telling the police her real name. She took the moralism of the duty officer in good spirit. She pulled the door to the police station almost to, and she turned left, heading away from Whitechapel. It was 1 in the morning on the 30th of September 1888, a short distance away east of Duftfield's yard. Was filled with people. Within 45 minutes, Catherine, too, would be found dead. Her injuries were a record of somebody's brutality. Again, there was no sign of the perpetrator. A cadre of detectives fanned out from Mitre Square to the scene of Catherine's demise, and back in the direction of Whitechapel. 2 clues were found. A piece of Catherine's apron had been cut, and a portion stained with blood was discovered in the doorway above it. Above it, anti-Semitic graffiti had been appeared unseen by the beat policeman to his previous rotation. Had the killer stopped to chalk his prejudice neatly into his bizarre criminal narrative? Did it seem possible with the police already out great numbers after Streit's murder earlier that morning? Perhaps hubris was taking over, but if so, there followed an unlikely intermission of more than a month. The trail went cold. Was the killer in retirement, or would he return? Mary Jane Kelly. Of all the Ripper's victims, Mary Jane Kelly was the most enigmatic. Her death brought her to the notice of posterity, but her backstory remained shadowy and largely out of reach. She herself, having fallen into a relationship with a fish market porter named Joseph Barnett, provided a detailed history, full of adventure and sadness. Some aspects of her self-described past now appear to check out, but still a comprehensive and verifiable overview of her background continues to elude researchers. The photograph of Mary Jane's corpse on her bed, devastated of practically everything which made her human, is the last hideous memento of Jack the Ripper's murderous fugue. In a break with his previous habits, the Ripper ventured inside to kill, and apparently satisfied himself that he was unlikely to be interrupted that night. Barnett had indeed moved out of the squalid room in Miller's Court, which he had shared with Mary Jane a few weeks earlier, insulted her by her return a regular prostitution, leaving her alone. Living upstairs, Elizabeth Prater heard a cry of murder at about 4 in the morning on November 9th, 1888, but she did nothing about it. Mary Jane's lifeless body was discovered shortly before 11. One senior policeman reviewing the case later on, concluded that the abattoir scene in Miller's Court had tipped the mid of its creator. Perhaps it is uncertainly true to say that nothing on a comparable scale happened again. Jack the Ripper's true identity died on the blanched lips of Mary Jane Kelly. The Jack the Ripper murders in London in East End, also known as the Whitechapel murders, have been an enigma since as far as back as the Victorian age. The mysteries surrounding the identity of the infamous London serial murderer have become as complex as the murderers themselves, and the London police, as well as people from all around the world, are still speculating on Jack the Ripper's true identity. It is believed that the Whitechapel Jack was behind the murders of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Streit, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. However, some believe that Jack the Ripper could have been responsible for up to 11 separate murders in London between 1888 and 1891. After interviewing over 2,000 people, investigating 300, and detaining 80 others, the London police were still dumbfounded to the real identities behind all these atrocious murders. During the course of the investigations, however, police narrowed down the suspect to several men. None were formally charged. There were five of the most likely suspects behind Jack the Ripper murders, as well as the facts against them. Number 1, we have Montaigne John Druitt. Although there were not many concrete scientific evidence against him, the fact that Jack the Ripper's murders in London's East End ended after Druitt's suicide convinced one of London detective Melville Leslie McNagton that Druitt was in fact Jack the Ripper himself. Montaigne Druitt was an Oxford-educated man from a fairly good family, although some believed that he was sexually insane. He was born in Wimborne Minster, Dorset, and during his lifetime, he once worked as an assistant schoolmaster in Blackheath, London. Many experts believe that Druitt was behind the murders, as they were convinced that Jack the Ripper was a Whitechapel local. Druitt resided a few miles away from Whitechapel on the other side of the Thames, and he was also seen in the Whitechapel area around the time that Jack the Ripper murders were taking place. On November 9th in 1888, 7 weeks after the murders of Mary Jane Kelly, which is believed to be Jack the Ripper's final murder, Jack the Ripper's body was found floating in the Thames. Investigators believed that the cause of death was suicide, and that he had been at the bottom of the river for at least several weeks, around the time Mary Jane Kelly's murder. Carl Feigenbaum. This is the second suspect, by the way. Another likely suspect behind London's Jack the Ripper murders was the 50-year-old German merchant sailor Carl Feigenbaum. Feigenbaum was also known to be a psychopath who confessed to mutilating women, and even his own lawyer believed that the client was Jack the Ripper as well. Feigenbaum went to many aliases during his lifetime, and was known to be working as a merchant on ships that had been docked near Whitechapel. Records prove that Feigenbaum was working in Whitechapel on every single date of the 5 Jack the Ripper murders in London's East End, and his co-worker were often seen at the nearby brothels as well. After Feigenbaum immigrated to America, sometimes around 1890, he was convicted of murdering a woman by the name of Julianne Hoffman and was sent to the electric chair for his crime. Experts also stated that there were striking similarities between London's Jack the Ripper's murders and the slaying of Hoffman. Third suspect, Aaron Kozminski. Several highly esteemed police officers believed that the Polish barber Aaron Kozminski was behind the Jack the Ripper murders in London, and the fact that his mitochondrial DNA was found on Catherine Eddowes' shawl certainly doesn't help his case. Kosminski was born sometime between 1864 and 1865 in Russia and had settled in London in the early 1880s. Kosminski was Jewish and was living and working as a hairdresser in Whitechapel during the time of Jack the Ripper's murders. He apparently had a very strong hatred of women and had homicidal tendencies, and was even sent to an asylum in 1889, where he died shortly after. Police documents from the time of Jack the Ripper's murders revealed that officials suspected a man by the name Kosminski, although Aaron Kosminski wasn't pinpointed as a suspect until many years later. The next suspect is Francis Craig. In recent years, many Ripperologists have started believing that Mary Jane Kelly's husband, Francis Craig, was behind all of the Jack the Ripper killings in London. Craig was working as a reporter at the time of the murders and was even covering the police courts and inquests of the Whitechapel murders as well as other crimes in London's East End. Craig was born in 1837, was the son of a well-known Victorian social reformer, and some people suggested that Craig was suffering from mental illness, more specifically schizotypal personality disorder. He lived in Whitechapel Mile End Road, which is just 7 minutes away from the first Jack the Ripper murder scene, and in 1884 he married Elizabeth Weston Davies, who believed to have been a prostitute who went by the name of Mary Jane Kelly, the Jack the Ripper's final victim. Theories suggested that one of Craig discovered his wife was working as a prostitute. She went into hiding in the East End under her pseudonym. Craig started plotting her murder, but disguised his involvement by killing other prostitutes in the area beforehand. The last suspect that I'm going to talk about is Walter Sickert. In the book Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper Case Closed, author Patricia Cornwell pinpointed artist Walter Richard Sickert as the real Jack the Ripper, and even claimed to have found DNA evidence which linked Sickert to at least one of the Jack the Ripper's letters. But even before her book, Sickert, she believed to have been behind the Whitechapel murders since as far as back as 19. Sickert was born in Munich in 1860 and emigrated with his family to London in 1869. Sickert was known for painting prostitutes, and some believed that he used to insert clues and symbols about the Jack the Ripper murders into his artwork. Some experts suggested that the clues are so similar to the Jack the Ripper's crime scenes that only the true murderer would have painted them. It was also believed that Sickert was very impotent on having several surgeries on his penis. Experts have always suggested Jack the Ripper may had led some kind of impotence problem, which is why he targeted prostitutes so violently. Many serial killers throughout history have been proven to be impotent and suffer from sexual problems, as the act of killing becomes their only means of sexual fulfillment. Cornwell also found mitochondrial DNA on several of Jack the Ripper's letters, which were a match to several letters written by Sickert, but it still wasn't enough to convince experts that Sickert had been behind the Jack the Ripper murders. Unfortunately, Sickert passed away in 1942 and took his many secrets to his grave. Thank you for watching, and we hope you stay tuned for the next episode.